Hello, my name is Lisa Archibald, and I'm a researcher at the University of Western Ontario. Today, I'm going to talk to you about our research study looking at language, reading, and math achievement in school-aged children.
This is a project that I've been completing along with my colleagues Janice Cardy, Mark Jonis, and Daniel Ansari. Today, I'll be talking about some information about learning and some details about our study. I'll conclude by considering what our findings mean for educating young children and talking about our future studies. Learning means that we're acquiring new knowledge or we're modifying our existing knowledge. In our research, we're particularly interested in school learning to read and write, learning math, and learning other subjects in school. We all know that there are individual differences in learning, and what I mean by that is that some of us find it easier to learn some things than other things. So some children do better at learning in school, some are particularly good athletes, some have gifts in the learning of music and other areas. And yet some children have trouble learning. They might have trouble learning to talk, to read, or to do math at school. And why is this? That's an important question and one that we've been considering in our research. In particular, we've been interested in the differences in cognitive or thinking skills that children might bring to learning, and trying to understand whether differences in those skills might account for differences in learning. We've been looking at basic responses to information, listening to information, seeing information, looking at the spatial relations in information and the quantity of information. This is the way that we respond to information that comes at us every day. We've also been looking at more complex thinking skills to see how they might be involved in learning in different areas. In terms of basic responses to information, some examples are the ability to quickly notice small details about information, to notice small differences between things that you hear or things that you see, to briefly remember information, and to recognize familiar information. Some examples of more complex thinking skills are working memory. Working memory involves the ability to hold information in mind that you're currently thinking about. You can think of it as the mental workspace, what you're thinking about and working out in your mind at the current moment. We've also been looking at language skills. This is the information we have stored in our brain about how to communicate with one another using our words. There are other complex thinking skills that may also be involved in learning, but we haven't addressed these in our particular study. The abilities a child brings in terms of basic and complex thinking skills can have an important impact on their ability to learn language, to learn to read, to learn math. And it might be that we need to consider skills and learning across all of these domains in order to better understand the learning difficulties. By better understanding these learning difficulties, we may have better options for helping these children to learn. So our research addresses these questions. What are the learning patterns that we see in children in terms of their strengths and weaknesses in several areas, language, reading, and math? And how do those basic and complex thinking skills relate to these different learning patterns? In our study, we had children from 34 schools in urban and rural settings. We invited all children from kindergarten to grade 4, and we had over 1,500 children participate. They participated at 3 different times in our study. At time 1, they each completed a screening. They repeated sentences, read words, read made-up words, and did simple arithmetic questions. Within about 4 months, we took a smaller sample of this group, and they completed many more tasks. Activities that looked at language, reading, math, short-term memory, working memory, and phonological awareness. And at time 3, which happened a year later, we completed a reassessment with all these children. They did all of the same measures that they had done at time 2. I'm going to talk about our findings in 3 ways. I'll talk about the learning patterns that we saw amongst these children, I'll talk about struggling learners in particular, and I'll talk about the changes that we saw over time. We found 6 different learning patterns amongst the children. This slide shows you 4 of them. Each column of 3 balls reflects one of the learning patterns. The blue ball indicates the score for this group on the spoken language measure, recalling sentences. The red ball indicates the score for this group on the word reading measures, and the green ball, the math measures. Looking first at column 1, you can see that the blue ball is low, indicating that this group had low scores in terms of spoken language. They have weak spoken language. They also had a fairly low red ball, indicating that reading may also be low in this group. Looking at column 2, you can see that the red ball is quite low, indicating that this group has weak reading skills. In column 3, both the green ball and the red ball are low, indicating that children in this group have weak math and reading skills. And the 4th column has a low green ball, indicating that children in this group have weak math skills. In addition, there were children who had low scores on all 3 measures and high scores in all 3 measures. So once again then, the learning patterns we observed included the 4 we just reviewed: weak spoken language, weak reading, weak math and reading, or weak math alone. In addition, there was a group of children who had below average scores in all areas, as well as another group who had above or average scores in all areas. This pie chart shows the proportion of children in each of the groups. You can see that 29% of this group had an average or above average skills. You can see that 5% of the group had weak spoken language, and 9% of the group had weak reading. If we look at those portions of the pie that reflect difficulties in at least 2 areas, that would include the group with weak math and reading, the purple group, 14%, and the groups with below average or above average skills. This group then would constitute nearly 2/3 of the group, while the children with difficulties in only one area, spoken language, reading, or math, represented about 1/3. So to summarize these findings then, we found about 2/3 of the children had similar learning abilities across areas, whereas about 1/3 had particular learning difficulties in one area. Let's look now at our findings related to struggling learners. By this I mean children whose scores were below average in at least one of our areas of language, reading, or math, and this was about 37% of the entire sample. This pie chart shows the proportion of children who fell into each of our profiles and who was also a struggling learner. As you can see, struggling learners fell in our profiles of weak spoken language, weak reading, weak math and reading, weak math, or below average overall. In fact, about 53% had difficulties in at least 2 areas of learning, while 47% had particular difficulty in only one area. We also looked at how struggling learners performed on our measures of basic thinking skills and complex thinking skills. So if we look first at our results for remembering words, that is our basic ability to hold on to sounds that we hear. What we found is children who had weak language or weak reading or below average overall had weaknesses in this area. We looked at the ability to manipulate sounds in words. This is called phonological awareness, and it looks at how children can take out individual sounds in words and change them or relate them to other sounds. In fact, all of the children, except for those with weak math, had difficulty on this measure. We had children rapidly name letters, and those with weak language, weak reading and math, and below average overall did poorly on these tasks. We looked at those working memory skills that I mentioned before, and as well we looked at the ability to reason or to think about things when words aren't involved. And it was the children who scored in the below average range overall who had difficulty on these measures. One of the important things about these results is it indicates that we can look at those basic and complex thinking skills and see which areas a particular struggling learner might be having difficulty in. And it's these areas then that we might be able to help that child improve. So to summarize our finding for struggling learners then, we found that children who were struggling to learn had different characteristics. Some of them had trouble with language or reading or math or a combination of these. And in fact, we found that to be about half and half. Half of the children had difficulties across the board, and the other half had more specific difficulties in one area or another. We also found some association between those basic and complex thinking skills that we were measuring and the particular learning profile. So we found that those with an overall below average learning profile had more general difficulties on our cognitive tasks, while those with language difficulties had poor scores on our word-related tasks. Those with reading difficulties had more specific difficulties on some of the word-related tasks, but not all of them. And in this particular work, the children with math difficulties alone did not show poor scores on any of our word-related or working memory measures. And finally, let's come to our results that look at changes over time. First of all, we took those results we got at time 2, and we looked at children who were younger in that group and older in that group. So our younger group was 5 to 7.5 years old, and our older group was 7.5 to 10 years old. What I'm showing you here is the proportion of children at those ages that fall into one of those struggling learner profiles. So if we look first at the row that's labeled younger, you can see that 29% had weak language skills and 19% had weak reading skills. 10% had weak reading and math, 47% had weak math skills, and 5% had a below average overall profile. You can see the corresponding numbers for the older group, and what you'll notice here is that the proportion of children with weak language skills increased a little bit, as well as those with weak reading and math, whereas those with weak reading alone and weak math alone, those proportions decreased. These results suggest that over time, children might come to have more difficulty in both reading and math, or reading, math, and language. We also looked at our results for children who completed our testing at both time 2 and time 3. That was about a year apart. We found that 24% of this group no longer had performance difficulties on our language, reading, and math measures. The majority of the group, 53%, continued to struggle with their learning in the same areas. That is, if they were having difficulty in the area of language in our first testing, they did again in this last testing. If they had difficulty in reading, they continued to have difficulty in reading. A smaller proportion, 18%, changed in terms of their learning profile. Most of these changed to having more difficulty in terms of language or difficulties overall. So to summarize our results for changes over time in our data, we found that about half of the children tested continued to have the same learning difficulties over a 1-year period. And at our 1-year follow-up, the dominant profiles amongst our struggling learners were those of weak language or more difficulty across all of the areas of language, reading, and math. Taken together then, the results of this study suggest that there are both general and specific learning profiles amongst children in general, and that struggling learners also have these same kinds of profiles. We did find that some cognitive skills differed for each learning profile, and we also found that these profiles may change over time. What do these results mean? Well, if we consider first the children who had reading difficulties, there were 3 types. Some of them had a language learning difficulty, and because they were having trouble with their talking, they may also have had trouble with their reading. We had children who had difficulty with both reading and math. something similar about those tasks was difficult for these children. And we also found children whose difficulty lay only in the reading area. Something unique to reading was difficult for these children. We found that two types of learning difficulties may increase over time. In particular, specific language difficulties and combined reading and math difficulties. This might mean that the skills that you're learning in reading and math become more similar as you progress through school, and so your difficulties become more general. And yet there may be this different group who are still struggling with the language skills, and this is impacting their learning generally. What kinds of basic activities could you engage in to help support learning? Well, in terms of language skills, we saw that learning new words was difficult for these children. And so engaging in activities that help them learn new words is an important piece of helping them to develop language. Having them repeat new words, break those words into individual sounds, relate those words to other words that they know are important to new word learning. In terms of reading, we saw that these children had more difficulty with manipulating sounds in words. So working with sounds in words is important for this group, helping children to identify the sounds, to compare them with other sounds, to swap sounds around, to break apart sounds from other sounds in the word. Another thing that helps with reading is improving how quickly you can read single words. So practicing reading words that the child already knows a little bit more quickly is another good activity for reading. And in terms of math skills, it's knowing about the size of a group that might be important. So being able to quickly guess if there's a lot of items there or fewer items there and comparing that to other groups is an important skill for math development. There's still lots to learn about how children learn, and our future studies will continue to address these questions. Our team is involved in brain-based investigations of basic information processing. That is, taking measurements from the surface of the head that tells us about the thinking that's going on inside the brain. We'll also be continuing to look at those thinking skills and how they differentiate language-related skills from more number-based skills for math. And we'll be particularly looking at those working memory skills in relation to language skills and how intervention in these areas might have an impact on learning. Thank you very much for taking the time to listen to our podcast. I invite you to visit our website for more information. You'll find our annual newsletters posted there and much more. Thank you.